Joining me today is a scholar of communication whose work spans the history of propaganda, military recruitment advertising, and the spread of disinformation in digital media. She's an associate professor of communication at the University of Pittsburgh at Greensburg and a member of the Pitt Disinformation Lab. Dr. Jessica Ghilani, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian. I'm really excited to be here.
You research propaganda, persuasion, and disinformation across both historical and digital contexts, from wartime messaging to algorithmic platforms. So, how do you define propaganda and how does it differ from persuasion more broadly?
This, this is such a good question, and I'm so glad you're starting off with this. I think that, persuasion is something we are doing all the time. We are constantly thinking about how to kind of hasten the outcome that we want. But propaganda is a much more complex process. There's usually a coordinated effort and maybe even a campaign to try to bring forward some kind of outcome that is more complex than most day-to-day persuasion. So that outcome might be an ideological one. It might be one that encourages particular kinds of behavior. So in some of my classes, I talk about the ideology of consumerism and how we are kind of conditioned through lots of messages that we encounter in advertising to not just buy a product to solve a problem in a finite way, but to believe in consumerism as a problem solver for our lives broadly. So we have the phrase retail therapy, for example. And, if we have a bad day, we need a little treat. And if we have a good day, we also need a little reward. So all of that gets kind of wrapped up in this broader system of belief. For me, that is when things get into the realm of propaganda rather than just mere, one-off persuasion.
Yeah, a lot of your work is rooted in media history, which feels different from most different disinformation research that stays focused on the present.
Yeah.
So, what insights does the historical study of propaganda offer that contemporary analysis tends to miss?
I think that one of the reasons why I'm so drawn to looking at history when I want to kind of understand the present is because it makes things feel a little less urgent, a little less unprecedented. And by kind of looking back to moments where embellishment or propagandic efforts and campaigns drew deep division within the American public, it helps to make the present day seem more solvable as a set of crises, as a set of kind of emerging considerations and stressful news stories and headlines. So for example, when I do outreach work on this, when I like go out into the community at like a public library or something and give a presentation about how to understand mis and disinformation, I often start with yellow journalism in the 1890s when the newspaper scions, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, were wanting very much to be the number one newspaper in New York. So William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer had the New York Journal and New York World. I forget which one had which. If I had prepped a little more in advance, I would have that at the ready. But those names, Hearst and Pulitzer, those are names that we know that continue in our media today. So these are very influential media names, and they had incredibly robust media businesses. And they were both in competition for the same cartoonist. The cartoonist worked for one of the papers, and the cartoonist wrote these very incisive political cartoons about the politics of New York City at the time and the economic disparity and things like that. And people loved it, and they really, enjoyed these cartoons, and it made them feel like, they wanted to buy more of the newspaper. So one of them hired away this cartoonist to the other paper, and that really catalyzed this into a full-blown, like, take no prisoners style, like business war between these two. And ultimately, the embellishment of their kind of news environment was such that we got drawn into the Spanish-American War under false pretenses. So this is something that if you wanted to learn more about, I'm not like an expert on this particular time period, but it's just one that I like to use as a starting point to get people thinking about how our information environment, when it is distorting, can really be a huge problem for all sorts of reasons, but it's something that is not a new problem. So I show these three different covers of the paper, and you can see from different years of the New York Journal, you can see how the headlines get bigger and more sensationalistic, and the images get larger and more intense, and basically trying to kind of tug at people's emotional perspective rather than portray the information in a measured, calm way. And then, just a couple years later, in World War I, there were similar kinds of considerations made by the Wilsonian government at the time. Woodrow Wilson wanted the United States to intervene in World War I. He wanted to deploy troops to fight in this war, but the American public was very divided in terms of whether or not they wanted to do that. Some people were extremely resistant because the style of war was in these deep trenches, and it was incredibly violent and brutal, and the casualties were, very high numbers, and a lot of people, especially a lot of women, a lot of mothers were like, we are not sending our sons to, die over in this war. So there were people who were pro-isolationism and people who were pro-interventionism. And the way that they tried to bring folks into the fold was through a Committee on Public Information, the CPI, it was called, headed by George Creel, so sometimes called the Creel Committee. And George Creel trained a bunch of people to give short speeches spontaneously in public spaces and public venues to try to draw support for the war. This was like a time period when there were only silent films, but film was a great new technology, so people would go out to see films. And before a film would start, one of these people who were trained, they were called, I think, the 3-minute men or 4-minute men. They would ask if they could give a presentation, and they would get up and say, this is why we absolutely need to fight in this war. And there were a lot of propaganda posters as well, but they specifically steered clear of that word and said, we are not doing propaganda the way that our enemies would do, or the way that, the enemies of the countries that the United States was otherwise aligned with would do. We are instead spreading a propagation of the faith in why this is important for American values, why we need to protect the values of democracy and innocence overseas, and that sort of thing. And the same thing happened in World War II as well. It was a different committee. It was called the War Advertising Council, which is now known as the Ad Council. You might see Ad Council ads today. So that still exists. And during both of those war efforts, volunteers from the advertising industry, which in World War II time period was very fledgling, is just sort of a newer thing to outsource your advertising. If you were a business, instead, you would just have a guy in-house who would, put together an ad for a newspaper. So that process of outsourcing, one of the things that was really important to people in the industry was that they prove their value to the broader population. So they volunteered to be a part of this Creel Committee and to put together some of the most famous illustrators of ads from that time period were involved. So Charles Gibson, who is renowned for having drawn the Gibson Girl, which was like the standard of beauty in the 19-teens, this very beautiful face with like coiffed hair and clothing up to the neck before the 1920s flapper era of fashion changed everything. He was one of the cartoonists who volunteered to illustrate propaganda posters. They didn't call them that, but that sort of thing. So this partnership between advertising and government was something that really, really interested me. And that was what catalyzed my investigation into the military public relations messaging of the 20th century. And I wasn't initially thinking of it as studying mis and disinformation. I was just thinking of it as studying persuasion and propaganda. And eventually, as that field emerged in the last 10 or so years, that came to be a way that people study it in the contemporary moment in terms of online information networks being distorted because of algorithmic platforms and engagement farming and all of the things that happen in monetized platform spaces. but it wasn't initially something that I saw as, going hand in hand until it became this kind of emerging field that doesn't necessarily look back into history for understanding about how these persuasive efforts have been around for a long time, with the father of public relations being the nephew of Sigmund Freud. His name was Edward Bernays, and he had in the 19 teens a propaganda campaign. He didn't call it that, public relations campaign, where at a parade in New York City, he paid socialites to pretend to be making a political statement about women's suffrage. And this was before, this was in the first wave of feminism when women didn't have the right to vote yet. And he paid them to light up cigarettes. It was very stigmatized for women to smoke, and he had a tobacco client. He paid them to light up cigarettes and say, this is a statement for women's suffrage, and they called them torches of freedom. And, that kind of thoughtful campaign effort that really brings together politics and advertising, that's the sort of thing that I just think is really fascinating. So that was very
Definitely.
long-winded. I don't know if that addressed your question or not.
Yeah, definitely. On this idea that propaganda is not something that's new or unprecedented, but it is a changing field with the rise of social media or Gen AI.
Yeah.
Your research stretches from the World War era to the digital age across very different media environments. So, how has the infrastructure of propaganda changed from the World War era to the digital age, and what stayed the same?
So, one of the biggest changes is the fact that we are siloed as consumers of information. Media of the past was very consolidated. So, the audience would, be reached in a large number, whether it be through broadcast radio, broadcast television, through print magazines, the circulation of print newspapers. Those numbers were a lot higher than they are now, whether we're talking radio, listenership, viewership, or subscriptions and readership for print. So the messaging that can reach people can be highly tailored to their perceived interests based on what the algorithm learns about them and what it predicts and expects about them, and what it prioritizes in terms of how it's been coded. So, my For You page looks very different from my students' For You page, for example. And the kinds of ads that are targeted toward me reflect the things that the algorithm has already come to know about me based on my existing online footprint and behaviors, and whatever kind of data mining or data surveillance that app does, that I give it permission to do when I agree to the terms and conditions and sign up. That kind of sophisticated individual targeting was not at all feasible prior to the emergence of these technological venues. And when people were writing advertising copy for a campaign in the middle of the 20th century, they were thinking about where to place it, and they were thinking about these, big, widely read magazines, or maybe thinking about targeting it into like women's magazines or magazines geared toward college students, or people who are interested in science and technology, or people of color. Like, they could micro target, but it was much less micro than now. So now the technology can be manipulated in all of these different ways to not only target people, but also to, you know, do things that are kind of illegal, like allow people who are advertising apartment listings or jobs to particularly not be visible to people of a certain age or with a certain graduation date on their LinkedIn page, or not be visible to a person of color on Facebook. So, I mean, those literally go against federal laws, but we don't have regulations of these platforms that are enforcing that, even though I think there should be. I think there should be a much stronger public interest orientation built into our platforms. But right now, the priorities are basically like the shareholders and the benchmarks that the company sets. So, we have a highly consolidated tech media environment. Meta owns three of the top five social media platforms based on active monthly users. They have WhatsApp, Facebook, and Instagram. They bought two of those competitors because their product their primary product, Facebook, was not doing as well as they wanted. And rather than innovate, which is supposed to be what businesses do in a competitive business landscape that, allows for the survival of the best company, rather than innovate, they just kind of gobble up the smaller guys. And the same is true with Alphabet, which rebranded from being Google when they bought YouTube and Waze and all sorts of other things. So, one of the big problems that exists now is not that different from prior eras of media consolidation, but really the the lack of enforcement of some of our antitrust laws just makes a lot of this even worse because, people can, um, this is sort of related. So Facebook, there was like some sort of internal leak of information that said that Facebook makes billions of dollars off of scam advertising. And they know and they predict it in their projections for the future that they will make X billion dollars from advertisers who literally are fleecing their users by getting them to click on things and thinking they're buying like a real Lego set, but it's a fake website and they never get it. And then hopefully the person knows to file a chargeback or whatever. Or maybe they get their identity stolen and they have all sorts of other problems. Like they know this, which means that they could probably do a better job of sussing them out from being on their platform. But instead of that, they are, kind of keeping them there to make sure that it's a part of their business enrichment. And so I think for me, these micro-targeting platform environments have all sorts of problems in terms of mis and disinformation, but also in terms of just consumer protection stuff that should be basic, adherence to the Federal Trade Commission's laws. So I think there are ways that this problem of the lack of regulations of platforms affects the quality of our information environment and also just the general well-being of everyday people because of that profit orientation rather than an orientation toward the public interest.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, these regulations don't necessarily hold up to what they should be doing, or when they're not as strictly enforced as they should be, it sometimes feels a little bit overwhelming to be one person trying to combat that sort of
Yeah.
propaganda and trying to help sort of guide the media landscape back to a place where you're not being as manipulated. So, is there anything you think one person or an individual can do to sort of combat this?
Well, I think that, I mean, part of why I do a lot of community outreach work is because I want people to know about this. I think that I think the current political environment is not one that's very conducive to regulatory push within our tech industry. But I don't think that that's forever. And I do think that under the prior Secretary of the Federal Trade Commission, Lena Khan, there were significant gains made to try to enforce existing antitrust laws when it comes to our tech company and regulating those businesses. Google was one example of their search tool being found guilty of operating monopolistically, and they were supposed to be forced to sell off their Chrome browser. But during the change of administrations and the related kind of political will that changed as well, instead they have to just share some of their internal data with competitors. So I think, if we want to have regulations with teeth, we need to make sure that, when a judge declares that this is a monopolistic business, then they should have to sell off some of that rather than appease the existing, whoever the person is at the helm that's different from the prior person. So some of that is just like inevitable turnover that occurs when there's a new administration and the political priorities change. If there is an opportunity for there to be more political will in favor of regulation, then I think there can be regulations in the public interest at the federal level. But in the absence of that, a lot of efforts are happening at different state levels to try to regulate technology in different ways. So some states are trying to regulate AI chatbots and say that they should not be something that children under a certain age should have any access to at all. And there are attempts at regulating platforms, especially for teen accounts. So in California, they passed a law that says that parents are allowed, they need to be given the ability to turn off the algorithmic sorting function on social media platforms for teens. Or if there are people who are younger, I hope not, using those platforms for anybody under a certain age, that parents are given the ability to turn off that sorting order. The sorting order is really designed to disorient and to maintain a person's interest on a platform and feed them content that is not in a logical order. Social media, when it initially was, introduced, depending on, I guess, what you want to call social media, I would argue that message boards and chat rooms of the 90s were early proto social media. But the eventually algorithmic platforms, when they were first released, were all reverse chronology. So Twitter, for example, would start when you'd open it up, it would start at the most recent thing that someone you follow posts, and then you could scroll back through linear time and see everything that people posted in that reverse chronology. And same with Facebook. The feed that people had was a reverse chronology. So that algorithm is really designed to kind of try to optimize engagement and to keep people using that platform and scrolling for longer, looking for content that they can't otherwise find because their page is also filled with a bunch of algorithmically produced junk. The same is true with, the autoplay function on YouTube, for example, hiding through deceptive design practices, the ability to toggle off autoplay, because so much of their numbers come from what's called passive viewing. Same with Netflix, frankly. Passive viewing is, when you just kind of let the algorithm take you on a ride and, watch the next thing. Not being able to toggle that off is a huge problem for parents because if they want to give their kid, an iPad for a half hour, that kid is going to fall down a rabbit hole if you can't have a better understanding of what kind of content they're going to see and how that's going to be algorithmically produced. So my hope is primarily in terms of advocacy work and legislation that's being passed at state levels around the country. And I'm actually a part of an organization in Pennsylvania called PA Unplugged, where we are advocating for, meaningful, thoughtful regulations within school districts about tech when it comes to, does a 5-year-old have to bring home a Chromebook every day? That seems like such an unreasonable thing for a kindergartner to need to do. But there are districts that require it of everybody in their, one-to-one, one student to one device policy. PA Unplugged helps parent organizations or parents form organizations to try to advocate for better digital well-being and more kind of thoughtful policy about how tech is used in school districts, and then also advocate for, common sense rules about using tech in day-to-day life.
Yeah, going back to that idea that it's the environment itself that is manipulating these people, not only the individual content. You're part of the Pitt Disinformation Lab, which treats disinformation as a civic and systemic problem rather than a handful of isolated lies. So, what is thinking about disinformation as more of an ecosystem rather than a collection of individual false claims change about how we understand the problem?
Yeah, it's really interesting about the Disinformation Lab. We actually have moved away from calling ourselves that because of the baggage that people attach to the word disinformation. So now we have rebranded as the Civic Resilience Initiative, which kind of reflects our goal to make this more of a community-oriented project than something that is, focusing on individual experiences. So with the civic I can never remember it. Pitt Disinformation Lab was easier to remember. The Civic Resilience Initiative. What we do is we try to give communities tools to be able to understand and identify information that is perhaps trying to divide them. There are a lot of popular Facebook groups that have cropped up in, like geographically community-oriented Facebook groups that have cropped up in the wake of the decline of lots of local newspapers. and around the country, there have been, the emergence of what's called news deserts. So people are seeking out community-based information from, about restaurants, about businesses, about events. And in those spaces, sometimes there are also inflammatory or misleading political comments and political posts that come up. So trying to kind of study those groups and understand how information circulates there is one of the things that researchers from the lab are doing. In addition to that, we have a lot of community outreach work that we do by going into libraries and community centers to present about this topic and try to foster media literacy. And we also, are trying to partner with community-oriented groups to be able to make sure that this programming is not just like top down, but that local librarians are able to present about it and make sure that the patrons are in the loop on things too.
Yeah, you stated that moving on a little bit, you stated that disinformation can plant fear in someone's mind in a way that's difficult to reverse. So,
Yeah.
what does that imply about the kind of harm that disinformation causes?
So, I think it's sort of a Pandora's box situation that once you see something and you're convinced by it, and confirmation bias is this phenomenon where we are more likely to believe in something that confirms our existing beliefs. So we're more likely to, like, if we run a search on a search engine like Google, we're more likely to we'll get conflicting information inevitably because the internet has um, no shortage of information across a range of perspectives. And if you get conflicting information, you ask a question, in a search engine, and you get things that say the exact opposite, you're more likely to say that the one that basically tells you what your impulse thinks is right. You're more likely to trust that source. So confirmation bias kind of operates in conjunction with algorithms to basically condition people to be more susceptible to disinformation and misinformation on some topics than on others. And, maybe it's like a political issue. If you're very, very passionate about um, an issue like vaccines, for example, if you feel very strongly that you should be able to like opt out of the mandatory vaccines that are in place at a public school, for example, that might be a scenario where you would run a search and you would get information perhaps from a very reputable source like the American Academy of Pediatrics or the American Medical Association, but you would be more inclined to trust the source that agrees with you. So one of the things that I think is, why disinformation is able to scale and do so well is because of how it works with misinformation, which is, unintentionally wrong, whereas disinformation is wrong on purpose, usually with an agenda. And that information, you become like the loyal misinformation foot soldier when you have been fully convinced. So a retraction or a correction is not going to be seen as much by, especially with like the algorithmic sorting piece of it. It's not going to be as widely seen as the initial stuff. And when somebody's been convinced, it's really hard to change their mind, especially if they're convinced on a topic that they feel passionate about because of confirmation bias.
Definitely. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't bring up one of the things that is changing the disinformation landscape the most right now, which is artificial intelligence. And so
Yes.
it's making everything from content production to targeting and distribution
Yeah.
much, much easier. And I
Yeah.
guess I wanted to get your opinion on how you see AI changing the nature of propaganda in a meaningful way, or is it just mostly accelerating dynamics that were already in place?
I think it is accelerating what is already effective about disinformation. It's allowing people to create it a lot faster and spread it a lot faster. But I think it's also, one of the problems of the widespreadness of disinformation and misinformation and AI is that nobody knows who to trust. They don't know what information, they don't know what to believe. And there's, low trust in legacy media when it comes to news and information. And there's also there's increased reliance on digital sources for information, but very low trust there too. So I think one of the major issues is that when people don't know what to believe, they are more likely to disengage entirely. And that's when people, kind of succumb to nihilism and they are less likely to participate in our elections. They're less likely to think that they can make a difference in their communities. They're more likely to isolate and disengage. And that's a real problem when we already are dealing with what people describe as a loneliness epidemic. So very often, if you're looking at a popular post on like Threads or Twitter or Instagram, people will accuse it of being AI. And that becomes this, elephant in the room. And people are like, oh, wait, is it? So in some ways, one of the things that might actually end up being a positive is that it's increased folks' awareness of how much bad information is out there. And they may be more prone to do what's called lateral reading, where you read across sources before jumping to conclusions, before allowing confirmation bias to set in. You read across multiple reputable sources to make sure that what you see is true. And then you can be like, oh, actually, that's a photo from 5 years ago that people are recirculating now, or that's a photo that is absolutely fabricated, like of Tom Holland and Zendaya's wedding. There's a bunch of AI images that people have generated because their wedding was secret. There's no photos of it, as far as I know. Um, People are, then forced to look and see, are there any official photos of this wedding? Or is this all just stuff that has been fabricated by an AI chatbot? So in some ways, it's made people more vigilant, but for some people, instead, it's made them more demoralized and unwilling to believe anything.
Yeah, to close, I want to end on a little bit more of a hopeful note or a more grounded everyday thing. So, what's one thing you wish people understood about disinformation that most people get wrong, or what's one piece of advice you have for people to navigate a world full of it?
I think that, that lateral reading practice, I think is so important. And it's something that even people who are alleged experts about it are still needing to do. Even, people who teach and write about this for a living still might get caught up in mis and disinformation that everybody is a potential get. So I think it's humbling to remember that, and it's something that I try to connect with others about. Sharing just like what was the most recent thing that totally had me because it was, an AI video of Punch the Monkey. But that video wasn't actually an authentic video, those sorts of scenarios. I think that can be really disarming and connecting. And because of how fragmented we are due to these platforms, and because of how kind of suspicious we all are about what is true, I think it will strengthen the meaning of our connections in real life. I think it has to, because, part of why there's a loneliness epidemic is because people are kind of falling into their algorithmic hidey holes and not talking to one another. And I think we need to come to an understanding about what it means to be human and what we have in common. And there needs to be a lot more grass touching and getting together with people in real life. And one of the things that, if there's this conspiracy called the dead internet theory, if it does come to fruition that AI and bots and trolls end up occupying so much oxygen in our platform environments, it's inevitably going to turn real humans away from it. And that means that we have more opportunity to start with something different or to connect in real life.
Amazing. Thank you